Hello friends, neighbors, and fellow VEDSies. I'm the Scottish Reviewer, and I thought that it was high time that we gave you another episode of our series From Stage to Screen. For those of you who are new to the channel over the past 3 or 4 years or so, From Stage to Screen is a collaborative review series, kind of like Books vs. Movies reviews that I started with the Mad Hatter, and we look at screen adaptations or movie adaptations of stage productions, plays, musicals, the odd comedy sketch, what have you. But unlike Books vs. Movies reviews, we don't pit the two stories against each other to figure out which one is better. Instead, we give the movie adaptation a grade at how well it made those changes that need to be made in order to adapt a stage story for the screen. Now, we haven't done a lot of these reviews, but a couple years ago there was a movie adaptation of a well-known and popular stage musical, and it also happens to be my all-time favorite musical, so there was no way we could not review it. I'll admit that when I first heard that they were making the James Levine and Stephen Sondheim musical Into the Woods into a movie musical, I was a little skeptical. I became even more skeptical when I learned that this movie was going to be produced by none other than Disney. Now, one might wonder why this concerned me. Into the Woods is, after all, a bunch of fairy tales, and if there's one thing that Disney is good at, it's fairy tales. But Into the Woods is more than just a straight-up telling of these fairy tales. In the second act, we see what happens after the happily ever after, where the characters have to face the consequences of their previous actions. And it's pretty dark stuff. It has a lot of morally gray areas, a lot of traumatic character deaths, and doesn't have what you would call a completely happy ending. All things that Disney, unfortunately, has a habit of whitewashing. But, despite my reservations, Disney put together a really good adaptation of the stage musical, one that I enjoyed watching and would watch again. But how well did it really do at adapting this story? Well, let's find out. This is From Stage to Screen, Into the Woods. Adaptations are graded in 4 categories, and we give each category a grade, either one of 3 passing grades or a failing grade. And then at the end, we tally them all together and we give an overall grade for the adaptation. So let's start with the first category, which looks at the movie as a particular performance of the stage story and grading it as such. Into the Woods is a collection of 4 fairy tales: Cinderella, Jack and the Beanstalk, Rapunzel, and Little Red Riding Hood, all combined together and tied together with another story that is fairy tale-like about a baker and his wife who are trying to lift a spell so that they might conceive a child. The first act plays out the 5 stories and takes us to their happily ever after, while the second act takes place some time later and shows us the consequences of those actions that got them to the original happily ever after. Jack's actions, for example, of stealing from the giant and then later killing him, brought down the wrath of the giant's wife onto the kingdom. Cinderella finds herself married to a prince she barely knows, living a life she's not entirely sure she wants. And Rapunzel has to deal with the trauma of having been trapped in a tower for most of her childhood. Each of the characters goes through quite a bit of character growth as the play progresses, and there's quite a bit of emotion and drama, especially in the second act. To say nothing of the music, which, as most music that is written by Stephen Sondheim, ain't easy. Sondheim doesn't write in traditional melodies or harmonies. In fact, his music is in many ways as much a suspension of reality as the stories that they're telling. And this musical contains a lot of music, and it is very operatic in style and contains a lot of characterization and explanation for what's going on, which is why the words of the music matter so much. Fortunately, this movie was cast remarkably well, and each one of the performances was spot on. James Corden was perfectly cast as the baker, blundering through his adventure and grappling with his past and his morals. And Emily Blunt turned in a great performance as the strong and supportive, but still flawed baker's wife. Now, they made an interesting choice in casting actual children to play the characters of Jack and Little Red, where they usually just cast young-looking adults in the stage versions, but the child actors they picked turned in really great performances for these characters as well. Anna Kendrick played a great Cinderella in spite of her American accent, and Chris Pine and Billy Magnuson were great as the two princes, playing off of each other beautifully, especially in the singing of Agony. And of course, Meryl Streep. You can't go wrong with Meryl Streep. Meryl Streep playing the witch. That's just perfect, although I would have liked to have seen more of her. Everyone's voice is also blended very nicely, which is especially important with this musical with all the different parts overlapping so that everyone could still be understood. Honestly, as far as this particular performance goes, I really have no complaints. I would almost like to see the stage version of this show done with these actors. Musically, dramatically, it just worked. This category gets a pass with distinction. Now we look at the setting and how they took the setting of the stage version and transferred it over to the screen. The challenge here is very often one of a perception of reality. Some stage shows try for an authentic picture of reality, which is easy enough to transfer over to screen. Some, however, opt for more of a suspension from reality and have a setting that suggests rather than shows us what's going on. Now, this show does have a setting of sorts, the setting of a far-off kingdom in a fairy tale. Both Act 1 and Act 2 start at the homes of Cinderella, Jack, and the baker and his wife, and then eventually move into the woods where the majority of the story takes place. And the nice thing about having almost the entire show take place in the woods is that you don't have to create a terribly elaborate set. A few trees can be created and moved around to suggest different settings, or you could just scrap the setting altogether and create the woods entirely through lighting and staging. Because these are fairy tales, the setting is by its nature generic, and the characters are at least somewhat aware that they are a part of a story, at least in the stage version, and this becomes more apparent in Act 2, but more on that later. Stage shows can play it pretty fast and loose with reality because we're sitting in the same room as the characters. We know it's not real, but we can suspend our disbelief, and because we're able to do it more easily in this setting, stage shows are able to get away with a little more surreality. Movies, on the other hand, have a bit of a firmer wall between audience and story. A movie is a little bit more like seeing a filmed glimpse of real life, and so they need to have one foot at least a little more firmly in reality. In this case, one of the biggest changes they made in the movie was to remove some of the more surreal aspects of the setting of the stage play. The stage version, for example, features a narrator who tells the story through Act 1 and eventually actually interacts with the characters on stage. That, however, is not something that's going to fly as well in a movie, and so they removed that aspect from the story, at least for the most part. As for the rest of it, I thought they did a really nice job incorporating this setting for a film. Probably the biggest advantage that this has was just showing us the sheer scope of everything. For example, it was nice to see that this kingdom and this village contain more than just the 20 people that we see in the stage version. And I loved the vastness of the woods that they showed us. In the stage version, it's difficult to get a perception of vastness because the characters are just wandering through the same few feet every time. But here, not only can we see a number of varied settings, but I love that initial shot where we see the main characters going off on their own paths and on their own stories, and then the camera pans up and we see just how huge this wood is. And the settings just look great. They were visually interesting and had a lot of detail, and in general it was just really nice to see some of the things that were just suggested in the stage version, like Jack's journey up the beanstalk, or the actual footsteps of the giant, or even just the palace. Yeah, the movie had to remove some of the more meta aspects of the story, but they did this without losing anything in the story, and what they did worked really well. So once again, this category gets a pass with distinction. Now, the third category looks at what really sets movies apart from stage stories: cinematography and editing. This is where a movie really has the chance to set the tone and the atmosphere of the story, in much of the same way that stage stories use staging and lighting effects. Into the Woods starts out as a very lighthearted story with lots of humor and some nice familiar fairy tales that only delve a little bit into their inherent darkness. But as the story continues, things grow progressively darker. People die, homes get destroyed, and the woods become an increasingly frightening and dangerous place to be as the giant continues to hunt for Jack to avenge her husband. The woods then can be represented with increasing shadows as the story becomes increasingly darker, and some of the more elaborate set pieces, like the beanstalk, can be suggested rather than actually shown. In addition, while the first act of Into the Woods does give us the familiar fairy tales, a lot of the big moments of these fairy tales are told secondhand. That is, we don't actually see Jack climbing the beanstalk and visiting the giant kingdom, we just hear him talking about it, and we don't see Cinderella actually attending the ball and meeting the prince, we just see her as she's running away from the ball. We see the witch's reaction to Rapunzel's liaison with her prince, but we don't actually see them together until the very end of the act. In fact, in both Cinderella and Rapunzel's cases, they don't actually get to be with their princes until the end of Act 1, which is probably why it feels like they barely know them throughout the story. Little Red Riding Hood's story is probably the only one that's actually told in its entirety on the stage, and even then, a lot of those parts are suggested and told secondhand. But what this means is that the set and the staging can be kept pretty simple because you don't have to worry about creating a giant kingdom or a ball at a palace or anything like that. You can see those stories just in the characters themselves. And ultimately, this is the story of the baker and his wife, and they're just interacting with these other fairy tale characters in order to gain the items that they need. So it makes a certain amount of sense that they would hear all these familiar stories secondhand. However, a movie is less about words and more about visuals, and a movie is not nearly as limited as a stage play. You can have multiple perspectives, special effects allow for some of the grander scenes in the story, and cinematography allows for a vaster presentation overall. And I feel like the movie struck a really good balance between maintaining the secondhand nature of the storytelling from the stage musical, but also allowing us to see some of these visuals and showing us the stories rather than telling us. When Jack is singing about his journey to the Giant Kingdom, we actually get to see some visuals of him climbing the beanstalk and see a little bit of the Giant Kingdom, but they don't show us so much that it leaves nothing to the imagination. When Little Red Riding Hood sings about being eaten by the wolf, we get to see that as well, but in kind of a surreal, sort of childlike way that actually fits very well with her telling of the story. And while we don't actually see Cinderella interacting with her prince, staying true to the tone of the stage version, we do see her fleeing from the actual ball. And I like that her song is on the steps of the palace, where she deliberates how to handle this situation with the prince, whether to live a lie or go back to her horrible life, is actually done in the moment on the literal steps of the palace, with everything kind of freezing around her as she considers the ramifications of her choices. Actually, that particular scene in the movie is more surreal than its stage counterpart, one of the few times when that's true of a movie being adapted from a stage version. In general, I feel like Act 1 put together the stories beautifully. Act 2, though, a little bit of a different story. I still feel like it looked great, and they created a nice, dark, foreboding atmosphere, and I like the fact that you can always almost, but not quite see the giant. But I felt like the pacing was off. Act 2 has a lot going on and a lot of pretty serious character development, and it really needs to take its time with all that and let what just happened sink in before moving on to the next thing. But in the movie, everything felt really rushed, like especially with the character deaths. I never really felt like we got time to register that the baker's wife was dead before they moved on to the next thing. And the same goes for Little Red and Jack realizing that their mothers are dead, and Cinderella and the prince having their goodbye. It really felt more like an obligatory checklist than an actual story, and it might seem like a small thing, but Act 2 really is the heart of the story for me, so for this category, I still give it a pass, but with qualifications. And finally, we look at the overall transition from stage to screen, the changes that needed to be made in the story, and just how well the writers did in adapting this staged story for the screen. As we said at the beginning, we had some reservations about this particular musical being made into a movie, because this musical really is pretty firmly a stage show. And by that I mean it's not trying to be as realistic as possible. It's not trying to be a firm portrayal of reality. And I knew that one of the biggest aspects we'd lose in going over to the movie was the presence of the narrator. Act 1 has a narrator who stands on stage and tells us the various stories and takes them through to the end. Simple enough plot device. Act 2 starts out in the same way, with the narrator starting to tell the story, but at a certain point in Act 2, the characters become aware of this person standing on stage with them and telling their story as it's happening. And to make a long story short, they decide to literally drag him into the story and throw him to the giant. And what starts off as being just kind of a joke ends up being one of the more dramatic and significant aspects of this part of the story. The narrator literally dies. He's the first death at the hands of the giant, and the characters realize that without him, there's no one to tell them what they're supposed to do, and so they have to just muddle through their story on their own, and that's the point when things start to get really bad and people start to die. And obviously, that's not the sort of thing that you could easily transfer into movie form. I mean, you could do it, but it would not be as easy to accept in a movie as it would be on stage. Also, the stage version of this story treats Act 1 and Act 2 essentially as two separate stories. Actually, for many years, I didn't even know there was an Act 2, because Act 1 acts as a complete story. It tells the complete stories that we are familiar with, taking them to their happily ever after conclusion. But then Act 2 starts after they've been living happily ever after for a while and now have to face the consequences of their actions. And not only do the two acts have two completely different stories, they also have two completely different and, some would argue, kind contradictory morals. The moral of Act 1 is basically when you see an opportunity for happiness, take it. Take the leap and don't look back. But the moral of Act 2 is that actions have consequences, and before you act impulsively, you need to think about what you are doing and consider those consequences very, very seriously. So, how exactly did this movie do in translating these things to the screen? One of the biggest changes they made was in eliminating the length of time that exists between Act 1 and Act 2. In the movie, the events of Act 2 start immediately after the events of Act 1, even while the characters are still celebrating their happily ever after. And aside from the necessity of watching the baker's wife's stomach blow up like a balloon as she suddenly becomes 9 months pregnant, which I think we can all agree was pretty stupid, this creates a number of problems in the story. First, it removes the parallels that Scotty talked about because we don't actually see an ending to Act 1 or a beginning to Act 2, and there are parallels for both the beginnings and the endings of both of these acts. Also, in the stage version, we get the sense that our characters have gotten kind of tired of their happily ever after. That even though all these bad things are happening, they're kind of ready for another adventure, especially Jack and Cinderella. But in the movie, there's no time for them to get tired of their happily ever after because they don't get a happily ever after. Also, when Cinderella's prince goes after the baker's wife, come on, dude, you've been married for literally half an hour and you're already going after another woman? Come on, the prince was a cad in the stage version, but not that much of a cad. The narrator was kind of a rough transition too. They did have a narrator throughout Act 1, and he did stop narrating for Act 2, but honestly, narrators dropping out halfway through the film is such a common thing in movies anymore that it really just seemed more like sloppy narration than them translating anything from the stage version. And finally, there was the thing that I was afraid was going to happen, which was the Disneyfication of the story. Granted, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, but it was still there. The first act was fine, because that's Disney's comfort zone, but the second act brings a lot of the characters' motivations into question and has them making decisions that are, at best, morally gray. It asks a lot of difficult questions about what's right and what's wrong, and partly because of the rushed pace of the second act and partly because of the downplayed importance of the development of these characters, those questions are not nearly as prevalent. The witch's characterization is especially troubling. In the stage version, Rapunzel is actually killed by the giant, which forces the witch to confront the fact that her actions towards Rapunzel and her treatment of her and locking her in the tower led Rapunzel to the exact sort of end that the witch has always feared she would face. And this impetus drives her actions for the remainder of the show, particularly in her hunting down Jack to give him to the giant. But in the movie, Rapunzel doesn't die. She just runs away with her prince, which isn't nearly as strong. At the end of the story, we're left with Cinderella, Jack, the baker, and Little Red Riding Hood. 4 survivors who have all experienced personal loss, who have all gone through hell of one kind or another, and who are just doing what they need to in order to survive. They have nothing left to lose at this point, and they work together in order to bring down the giant. And while you do get this sense in the movie, that's mostly due to the performances of the actors. The message still comes across, but not nearly as strongly as it could have. I know it sounds like I'm bashing the movie right now, and so I just want to say that the things that they did well in the movie were done remarkably well, and even the things that were done poorly weren't done so badly that it ruined my enjoyment of the movie. They really did do a remarkable job of translating this show into movie form, something that I felt could never be done. I do think that there are some things that could have been done better to make a good movie into a great movie, but they still did what I felt was impossible, and there's something to be said for that. So the transition gets another qualified pass. So with 2 pass with distinctions and 2 pass with qualifications, Into the Woods gets and exceeds expectations. It certainly exceeded mine. So thanks everyone for joining us for another From Stage to Screen review. We hope to be putting out more of these soon, so until next time, friends and fellow VEDSies, I'll see you tomorrow. Well, that takes care of that distraction. We're more than halfway done. Scotty hasn't even mentioned a Books versus Movies review. Now, it's only a matter of time before he brings it up. Scotty wants us out of the Stephen King universe. I'm remembering more this time. Me too. But as soon as Scotty snaps his fingers after a Books versus Movies review, the genre will change and we'll forget everything again. Of course, there's always a risk that another rift in reality will open. Seems like they've been sticking pretty closely to the horror genre since the Frankenstein review, but Who knows what'll happen when they switch the genre again.
Can we stop them?
I don't think so. And even if we could, I'm not sure we'd want to. The future I saw was only possible because we stayed in this universe, the Stephen King universe, for so long. We just need to let things take their course, no matter what that might be.
So what do? We can't just sit here and let it happen again.
I don't know. I don't even know that Scotty is to blame for this. The genres are out of control. He can't help himself.
Yeah, but we need to figure out something. If we don't, then...
Hatter. Good review today. It's nice to be doing these reviews again. Well, it's been a couple years. Probably time to start thinking about another books versus movies review, don't you think? Been giving some thought to some other Stephen King stories that we could do. There are a number of good movie adaptations that we could look at. For example, what were we talking about?
Not sure.
Oh, right, the genres. I'm not even sure Editing Man is to blame for it. I think it's beyond his control.
Do you think he's working with somebody? Your haberdasher? Arcana?
No, I think he's working alone, but there's some sort of force behind it. It's the same force that tells him how to edit the videos, you know? But we shouldn't do anything rash. Let's carry on with VEDS until we get to the end of the month. If luck is with us and we keep a busy schedule,